I'm going to demonstrate for you this morning how I do my research. And of course, I have to skip a whole bunch of steps because I'd be here all day if I included all of them. But this is basically just an example, and it has to do with a book that I just recently purchased online. So we're talking about Mathew Franklin Whittier's use of a single asterisk as a pseudonym or a star. This goes way back to 1829 and as far forward as 1873 in a whole bunch of different newspapers, like 11 different newspapers, over the course of Mathew Franklin Whittier's career. However, I first discovered it in the Portland Transcript. I knew that Mathew published a series about Ethan Spike. It was a satirical anti-slavery social commentary series. And I knew that from the literature about him when I first started. And I knew that he published that in the Portland Transcript and in the Boston Chronotype. So in the Portland Transcript, I found this instance of Mathew signing as an asterisk or star. And that's in the July 26, 1856 edition of this newspaper. This is a Portland Transcript for 1856 that I own. And if you go to the July 26th edition, you see Spiritualism in Portland. Mathew was a member of the Spiritualist Association in Portland, Maine, where I am now. And it's a long article. It goes very much into the group's finances, which would be typical for Mathew because he freelanced as a bookkeeper. So when he volunteered for organizations, he was a reporter and a bookkeeper. I mean, as freelance occupations. And he would either volunteer as the treasurer or the secretary for these organizations, typically social reform organizations. So apparently he was the treasurer for this group and spoke about the group's finances more than somebody normally might writing an article. So this is probably Mathew writing for the Portland Transcript as the treasurer. And here at the end of the article, you can see his star. That's the very first one I ever encountered. So then we're going to go to the Weekly Chronotype. This is earlier. This is a newspaper. It was a radical anti-slavery newspaper edited by Elijah Wright, who was one of the founders of the American Anti-Slavery Association. He was the secretary for that group. Here's what the Chronotype looked like. He was a very progressive fellow. And on the back page of this newspaper, there's one little article, and it reads, "The Cooper's Son, second edition, just published by James French, says this is a tale of the Revolution, written for the young, full of incident and graphic description, and contrasting in a very instructive manner the conduct of two youth who figured in those trying times. It contains an interesting chapter on the effect of intemperance, and throughout the book the author has so wrought up the events as to render the tale perfect of its kind." And there's the star. So that's Mathew basically reviewing his own book and announcing its second printing. And I knew that was him by style. I mean, first of all, I know that's his signature, and secondly, I know that that's the way that he brings the public's attention to his own work. He's done that a couple times anyway, including this one. Now, I want to go back and talk about how I knew that the asterisk or star was Mathew Franklin Whittier. So we saw the report on the Portland Spiritualist Association, signed with a star. This is called a reply to William T. Dwight, D.D. on spiritualism, and it's ostensibly by Jabez C. Woodman, Esquire, who was the president of that association. And it has to do with a traditional minister who was ragging on spiritualism, and then the president of the Spiritualist Association gave a talk countering Reverend Dwight's sermons about it. And then that was those lectures were published in book form, and in the front, the officers of the club request him by letter to publish it. And we see Mathew Franklin Whittier, M.F. Whittier, among the officers of that club. So therefore I know for sure that Mathew was an officer of this association. I also strongly suspect that Mathew was the force driving behind this, because it would have been his reports in the Portland transcript that, there was a review of the talks and a review of Dr. Dwight's talk and sermon and so on, and all that was Mathew driving this whole controversy behind the scenes. And in my opinion, Mathew would have ghostwritten this, because when he reviews the talk by Jabez Woodman, who was the president of a railroad company, by the way, he says that his notes were very disorganized. But this is extremely well organized. So I think that Mathew took those notes and ghost wrote this book, which is really a magnificent book, by the way. So I knew that Mathew was an officer in the association, and putting two and two and two together, I decided that Mathew was probably the author signing as the star, a single asterisk. And later on I found, hundreds in different newspapers and was able to confirm that. So what I just read in the Weekly Chronotype, that was Mathew Franklin Whittier, and I knew by the way that he wrote it that he was noticing the reprinting of his own book. I said, this is Mathew's book. So that's this one, The Cooper's Son, or The Prize of Virtue. It has to do, as he said, with a couple young people, and he contrasts their mode of growing up and their ethics and their morals and so on. Mathew was fascinated, apparently, by what caused the criminal mind, what caused a person to become a career criminal, because he had a view of psychology based on Christianity that everyone could be redeemed, and therefore even the worst criminal had to have a redeemable soul in his cosmology. But he didn't have reincarnation, and he didn't understand what I understand now, or what I theorize now, is that the sociopathic personality has been practicing shutting down his or her conscience for several lifetimes. And like every other skill in which someone attains mastery, this particular skill of shutting down one's conscience evolves over 5, 10 lifetimes, is my guess. And that by the time somebody gets to about the 10th lifetime where he or she has been practicing this, they inherit or incarnate with a body that chemically reflects that mental habit. So the body chemistry follows the habits of many lifetimes. It's not the reverse. So when you get to a sociopath, that person, in terms of their physical personality, has no effective conscience. That means they can do outrageous things, be outrageously hypocritical, tell the outrageous lie, and nobody can believe that it's a lie, because who would tell a lie that big? Well, the sociopath would tell a lie that big. And this was the sticking point in Mathew's cosmology and his psychology all his life. He couldn't figure out what made these people tick. So a whole bunch of these, well, I would say 5 or 6 little novels that Mathew wrote, maybe a little bit less, have to do with this particular question. He takes somebody from childhood in his novel and novelette, and he brings them up through childhood and tries to show the etiology of criminal behavior and criminal psychology. See how this person became a career criminal. Well, that's what these 2 books were. So The Cooper's Son, I won't go into except to say that the subtitle is The Prize of Virtue. And it occurred to me, normally the colloquial phrase is the price of virtue. So why is this the prize of virtue? Well, I think it was almost a little bit of a satire. The idea here is that the guy that does good things gets rewarded in his lifetime, not by karma, but in his own lifetime, things work out for him. Whereas we know that's not true in real life. In one lifetime, the do-gooder, the good die young, as they say. So I think that it was a little bit of a satire. He called it The Prize of Virtue. I think he wrote it, I think he originally ghost wrote it for somebody else, for a guy named Charles Burdett in New York, because he ghost wrote a couple others along this line in 1845 and 1846 for Charles Burdett. And this one, for some reason, didn't end up getting published by Charles Burdett, but I think it was by request. I think that Mathew was told he wanted a book that showed how, good things happen to good people, and Matthew wasn't totally philosophically on board with it, so he wrote The Prize of Virtue. So, but in this book, and this is how my research progresses from one thing to another, I learned about the star, then I found the star-signed notice in the chronotype about the Cooper's son, but then this one says, written for the young by the author of One-Eyed Dick. So now we've got another novel by the same person. Well, at any point, my theories can be busted. So if I find One-Eyed Dick and I find that it's totally implausible for Mathew Franklin Whittier, then this one goes down also. See? But I did find One-Eyed Dick, which is the book that I just recently obtained, an antiquarian copy. This was published in 1841, and this is also Matthew's. It's along the same theme, probably a real-life person taken from the news, I'm guessing, because it's called Richard White, or One-Eyed Dick of Massachusetts. And I'm going to read a little bit from it. Before I start, what you're going to find is that Matthew was a deeply committed Christian, but he had been taught esoteric philosophy by his future wife, Abby. At first, in late 1820s and early 1830s, when he was in his late teens, Matthew scoffed at it. He was skeptical. He was a skeptical philosopher. Gradually, she brought him around to where by 1841, he believes in these things, but he still doesn't have reincarnation, right? So nonetheless, what we have here, this is 2 years before A Christmas Carol is published, supposedly written by Charles Dickens. It was actually co-authored by Matthew and Abby in 1838 and 1839. I can prove this beyond a reasonable doubt. So this was written probably in 1840, which is to say the year after Matthew and Abby finished A Christmas Carol. So it's going to show very much the same mentality. And it does. What we have is a deeply committed Christian who believes in virtue, believes in Victorian virtues, and who is cautioning young people not to go down the dark path, basically, like Darth Vader, And this one has a rather beautiful little inscription in the front, which is kind of amusing to me. I think this is a teacher writing to a student, a female student, probably one that needs a little bit of guidance, I'm guessing. So here we have, Mary, this, a small token of my love, I send you wishing your prosperity. May you ever be found kind to your parents, teachers, and friends, and, above all, prepared to meet your God when called to bid adieu to the loved ones of earth. E. A. Hammond. Rather stark and rather Victorian, And if this is a teacher writing to a student, I'm guessing this is in beautiful condition. I'm guessing Mary never cracked this book, But anyway, I'm going to read a couple passages from it. As anyone would expect who was acquainted with the character of Richard, that's Richard White or One-Eyed Dick, the wasting of liquor by the father was equivalent to turning the son out of doors because the father had decided to throw out all of the liquor. The backstory of this is that when this took place, we're talking the 1830s, it was normal in American society in New England to drink hard liquor. Everybody, the kids would drink it, the little old ladies would drink it in church and during the sermon, it was normal. And pretty soon they figured out that it really wasn't such a harmless thing. But anyway, so the father has thrown out all the liquor, and the son, who's gotten rather used to it, is quite upset. As anyone would expect, who was acquainted with the character of Richard, the wasting of the liquor by the father was equivalent to turning the son out of doors, for he had positively declared, in an altercation with his father, that he would never remain at home unless he could occasionally be provided with his favorite beverage. Now, this is interesting because Matthew always drew from his own personal life. So much of Matthew's fiction has autobiographical hidden elements in it. So Matthew apparently ran away from home as a boy after a big fight with his father. I don't think it was about liquor, but it was about some other things. a girl at one point, and probably about not being allowed to attend college, apparently the second time at age 14. But he's drawing on his own life. Anyway, Mr. White briefly replied, Richard, I love you, although you may have become my enemy. This the scriptures, as well as my relation to you, require. But to favor the presence of that subtle foe, which has heretofore so long disgraced my cupboard, and breathed contagion throughout my house, and which I fear is fatally fixed upon you, I never can again. Being now old and feeble, I need your services. But for what will they be worth if you gratify your appetite for liquor? Should you leave me, you will be ruined. But if you remain at home and keep sober, the farm shall be under your superintendence, and you may be happy and a blessing to your aged parents. So Richard does leave home and so on. So we're going to skip to the end and catch a little bit of the author's advice at the end. He wraps up Richard White, who was captured and hung for his crimes. Thus ended the career of a man only 31 years of age, whose measure of affliction increased in proportion to his wickedness, and thus terminated the days of one who might have been a blessing to his family, an honor to the village, the accumulator of his own fortune, and the guardian of his own happiness. Beware then, young reader, when the demon of temptation persuades before you that you turn a deaf ear and flee from his presence. Be sure from day to day so to fill your mind with virtuous thoughts, and your hands with worthy deeds, that when Satan entices you, he may do so in vain. Let virtue give no place to vice. Shun the intoxicating cup and the twofold misery of the drunkard. Let truth be foremost on your lips, and innocence the basis of your joy. Ever keep in view some ennobling purpose, and bring all the powers of your body and mind to bear upon it till it is accomplished. Now, that may seem kind of corny to us, those of us that have thrown the baby out with the bathwater and thrown Christ out with traditional Christianity and the errors that it has been prone to, but it isn't. And it brings to mind a song called Make the Madness Stop by a group called The Free Design from the early 1970s. And in that song, there's a line that says, honesty and purity, beauty and sincerity. Doesn't that sound corny? Wish that I were corny. So I would actually run a clip of the music, but I think YouTube would probably snag it for copyright issues, even though I'm sure that the original composer, Chris Dedrick, would be pleased to let me use it. So much for automation, automated morality. But this just gives you an idea of how I do my research and how I have gone from one thing to the next and how careful I've been. For example, had I found this star-signed little notice in the chronotype and said, oh, that's Matthew, I know he's the star in the chronotype, and had I got hold of the Cooper's son, and it didn't look like something Matthew would write. It had something that was pro-slavery. It had something where animals were being treated cruelly. Those things are like, that automatically disqualifies Matthew, you know. Well, I would have had to say, no, I was wrong. He was noticing some other book, you know, but for some reason, but it wasn't what I felt and what I thought. Or had I looked in here and it said author of One-Eyed Dick, and had I found One-Eyed Dick and the same thing had happened, there's no way that this author of One-Eyed Dick had been Mathew Franklin Whittier. It had somebody laughing about being cruel to animals or something like that. I would have had to throw the whole idea out and say, well, it can't be, neither one of these could be Matthew. So I've been very rigorous in my research, and people that think that I just make claims willy-nilly, you know, and they don't bother to actually look at the research process, which is very carefully delineated in my ebooks, Mathew Franklin Whittier in His Own Words and Mathew Franklin Whittier in His Own World. I mean, they're as big as they are because I have transparently set out every single step of my research and how I came to each conclusion and what all the evidence was, pro and con, so that people in the future can go into those and see that I was serious about the way I conducted my research.